morning, and thank you again so much for joining us this morning. Shortly, I'll be handing you over to the intelligent and very knowledgeable Alistair Bayford, who is presenting today's webinar entitled Tree Planting and Establishment in a Changing Climate, a Contractor's Perspective. But before I do, let me tell you a bit about Alistair's background and career in the landscape industry. Alistair was introduced to the industry through various influential people during his childhood. One of them was his grandfather, who had a passion for cultivating and selling fuchsias, and his father, who worked as an estate manager and introduced him to the world of landscape management at a young age. At the age of 13, he stumbled upon landscape architecture and arranged a one-week work experience placement at Liz Lake Associates, and then subsequent summers working at a plant nursery and for a local landscape contractor. He achieved his undergraduate degree at Writtle College and a postgraduate degree at Greenwich, ultimately achieving chartership in 2008. In 2012, he accepted a role that involved overseeing the long-term management and maintenance of Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, which provided him with some of the richest learning experiences and proudest career moments. Alistair is a fellow of the Landscape Institute with over 20 years' experience in the design, construction and long-term management of parks and public realm projects across London and the South East. As Managing Director of Frost's Landscape Construction, he leads one of the UK's foremost landscape contractors, delivering complex schemes that unite design excellence, environmental sustainability and construction expertise. He has also directed multidisciplinary teams on some of the country's most ambitious regeneration and placemaking projects, with a portfolio that includes the iconic Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, as mentioned, and the Regent's Park. In addition to his role at Frost, Alistair also serves as a board director of the British Association of Landscape Industries, championing quality, collaboration, and the advancement of the landscape profession. This presentation today should last approximately 30 minutes. Please type in any questions you have using the Q&A function, and Alistair will endeavour to answer these for you. So without further delay, let me hand you over to Alistair.
Thank you very much, Mandy. That was some introduction, so I hope I live up to those expectations. So as Mandy's kind of given you an overview of my career, so I'm a chartered landscape architect. I've, for the last 25 years, been working in capacity as designer, client, and in contractor roles, designing, building, maintaining and stewarding landscapes for all of my career, and spent 13 years at Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in the pre, post and legacy stages of that project. I am Managing Director of Frost Landscapes and incredibly fortunate for the many opportunities I've had throughout my career, the people that I've been able to work with and watch, and those that I've been able to coach into the industry. Frost Landscapes has a 50-year heritage. We are an 85% employee-owned business and 18 months into that journey. Many of you will know that we are roof specialists. We're undertaking hard and soft landscaping projects in the capacity of principal contractor and subcontractor, and we operate in that golden quadrilateral, so London, Cambridge, Oxford and Birmingham, all those areas in between are our kind of location of work. Most people, I hope, are aware of that typical Venn diagram, which is used in project management. Certainly during my career, it was always stressed that projects, you make decisions on time, cost and quality. One of the aspects that, yes, is becoming more common, but perhaps isn't given the same weight, is environment and sustainability. Because ultimately, every decision you make on a project has a consequence. Every line on a drawing has a consequence, both in the materials you select, how that line is built, how it's maintained, and then ultimately how it might be deconstructed at the end of its life. For us, Carbon Journey has been one where in 22 we set our baseline. So at that point we were generating 151 tonnes of CO2e per annum based on our operations across our scope 1 and 2, covering the 4 categories of carbon emissions. In our most recent audit, which covers the year 24, we've reduced our carbon emissions by 48%, and our intensity ratio today is in the order of 10 tonnes per £1 million worth of turnover. So it's often the overlooked contribution to any project. We look at EPD certs and how much carbon's been produced from cradle to gate with our products. But when you then consider the contractors that are building these schemes, it's worth bearing the intensity ratios for operations in mind, because ultimately that's the operational carbon being exhausted when we're building out a project. I want you to think about this, these 2 icons really. We're all ultimately aware of our carbon footprint, but it's our carbon handprint that is the most significant for any project. 80% of the impacts, both positive and negative, are going to be decided during that design stage. So every line on that drawing has a consequence. Every material that's specified has a consequence. And understanding what those decisions, the impact they can have on the project's carbon and its success in the future, needs to be considered during that design stage. For those of you that I've had the pleasure of presenting to before, this slide features quite commonly in my presentations. It's the major oak. So if I was a tree, I'd want to be this one, a good old-fashioned English oak with I suppose its age. How old is it? You can get anywhere between 800 and 1200 years old in terms of what gets banded around. It's got a 11-metre circumference, 28-metre canopy, 616 square metres of canopy cover. There's 23 tonnes of weight there and 6 tonnes of carbon stored. And when you look at an oak tree of this size and this age, it's functioning for biodiversity. There are known to be 2,300 species associated with native oaks. 326 of them are obligate species, so they rely solely on oak and little else. A tree with huge cultural significance, a tree of legend. Certainly my childhood, inspiring stories of Robin Hood, seen many monarchs, prime ministers and wars throughout its life. But inevitably, this is quite a common picture in my world, and walking through towns and cities where trees are perhaps overlooked in terms of their management and maintenance. We see lots of trees failing in the landscape and often resulting in their ultimate removal from that landscape. And of course, we know what benefits trees bring to our urban environments. They provide shade and cooling, visual amenity, function for biodiversity, create microclimates which can improve the environments in which we sit and use those spaces, and can improve air quality. But those benefits are only really possible if that tree achieves its canopy cover and ultimately performs at 100%. Just to give you a context to the number of trees that we as a business will be planting in a year, we've planted just over 600 year to date, and we'll have planted another 1,100 by the end of March. So just shy of 2,000 trees put into the ground during the last 12 months. But we're supposed to be good at this stuff, right? But you can walk around London today and see numerous examples of trees that are either not there anymore, have had their tree pits tarmacked over, are struggling because they're being strangled by tree ties, or image in the left, I don't quite know what's going on there. But, you know, best endeavours and everything else, there are plenty of examples where we are getting it wrong. And only last week on our way to a meeting, these 2 examples: a tree that's ultimately failed in the landscape and has subsequently been felled, and a tree that I don't quite know what's happening with its staking there, but, you know, it's destined to perhaps struggle as a result of that oversight. And I suppose a picture that tells 1,000 words. an advert for an electric car with 2 tree pits absent of their trees. Again, walk around London and you'll see many examples of trees that have struggled. So embodied carbon in trees, where does it come from? You've got to consider all those aspects, from installation to transport to site. Growing an establishment, that's both the growth in the nursery setting and establishment on site afterwards. All of those accessories we seem to want to put in a tree pit, and not forgetting maintenance into legacy. I wanted to just cover off the impact of size of trees, because of course it ultimately all comes down to transport. So when you look at transport, when you're bringing material in from Europe, it's got about 6 times the CO2e per tree. And when you're looking at obviously smaller stock, number of in the load increases, so therefore its impact is less. But we have this perhaps this availability conundrum at the moment, where nursery stock isn't available in huge numbers, so there is this reliance on Europe. And when you do then move across to Europe for bigger stock, to transport a tree across from Eastern Germany is generating about 450 kilograms of carbon per tree in the transport alone. Now, you will have access to these slides, so I'm not going to read verbatim the next few slides, but what I wanted to try and do is start to get to grips with the embodied carbon in a tree and the decisions that are made during specification. And if you look at the multiple layers of things that end up supporting planting trees in our landscapes, you start to then establish where you have that data through an EPD or where you don't. So certainly a lot of the most frequent things like soil and the tree itself, the data just doesn't necessarily exist in a format that can be utilised accurately. And if we were to move through to what that actually means, and bearing in mind that the majority, or certainly a large proportion of the carbon in this calculation is associated with the tree grill, we are generating about 1.5 tonnes of CO2e per tree pit when we're planting a tree into an urban landscape. And then when you translate that across to carbon sequestration rates over the years, if you've got a very efficient tree pit, say of a tonne of CO2e for the pit, it's going to take that tree best part of 25 years to achieve net zero, and that's sequestering about 40 kilos of CO2e a year. And if you're then getting to a really heavy design on that tree pit, you could be looking at up to 100 years. So that said, it's highly unlikely that an urban street tree will ever be carbon positive during its life. When it comes to those factors of design considerations and specifying trees, we've got to be looking at a number of different factors, from the tree species selection, and what I would like to see more of is diversification in the tree species, not having more than 5 to 10% of the same species in any planting scheme, considering all of those factors that will ultimately contribute to long-term establishment of a tree, ensuring that it's got the right management and maintenance, ensuring that we're minimising the number of accessories that are placed into the soil. We're considering procurement, we're looking at carbon miles, we're looking at all of the factors that have influenced the growth of that tree during its life in the nursery. And then we're just getting back to basics, considering the right tree for the right place. We're looking to retain trees where we can. And then we're considering all of its functionality, both for biodiversity, carbon sequestration, improving air quality. You're wanting to consider species that have got the ability to filter particulate matter at 2.5 parts per million. A couple of images that personify whole life carbon and the limitations in landscape are the ones that follow. This is a project I delivered in 2012. And then there's been a decision during its 10-year life, because the next image taken in 22, to remove the natural turf and replace it with artificial. Now, that's either a management and maintenance decision, but either way, you look at the carbon that was attributed to actually installing that, to the carbon to remove it and then replace it with this system. When we're delivering projects and we're asked for whole life carbon assessments, we often look at the long term. How long is that scheme going to be performing? What's the design life? But if that scheme is only going to be there for 10 years, that statistic, that calculation is indeed inaccurate and perhaps false. Soft landscape specifications, probably the bane of many contractors' worlds at the moment, because ultimately contracting comes down to risk. I think specs are unnecessarily complex. We are reliant on a national plant specification that dates 1992. And when you consider what's changed in those 30 years, and more so in the last 5, where climate change, biodiversity and biosecurity are having an impact, but our traditions and conventions, what isn't readily referenced in the MBS is BS 8545, which is a standard dated 2014, written by the industry, and covers those key years from nursery to independence in the landscape. And it's certainly something that I would like to see referenced more in specifications, and certainly that the industry is acutely aware of it and aware of its contents. Because if you then move over into that planting root ball trees between that magic period of October to March, that doesn't exist anymore. If you look at the diagram to the top, those were the age-old reliable timescales for carrying out certain works. But if you adjust that for climate change, root ball trees, we might not be lifting them until November because of trees not going into dormancy, and we may well be planting them right through to April and May, purely because of the seasonal constraints that exist now. And of course, not forgetting that we're pretty much a 365-day a year operation, where subject to project programs and constraints, we're having to put trees in the ground at any time of the year, whether they're dormant or in full leaf. Understanding tree procurement is incredibly important, and this is more so when I get to the end of the presentation. But if anyone's cycled around Europe, particularly Belgium, you'll see row after row after row of starter stock. And this is primarily material that will end up coming across to the UK if nurseries aren't growing it themselves, or it will form those much larger specimens out there in European nurseries. And if you look at the life cycle from a 6-8 centimetre up to a 50-60, you're talking about anywhere between 14 and 24 years of investment in time. And that's species dependent, but ultimately you're waiting a long time for your investment to come through to fruition, and having to invest in what the market is telling you. And that's pertinent given this desire to diversify our tree stock, make sure that it's more suitable for climate change in the future. If it takes 14 to 24 years to produce the stock, we should have started back in year 2000, creating the stock that can meet our needs into the future. Anyone will know root ball trees are Hessian wrapped, left image there, but we have to work miracles in contracting. Often we're taking root ball trees, we're extending their life above ground in the nursery by core wrapping them, which enables then the tree to be planted out of season from ultimately end of April through to August. Because the important thing to recognise when you get to containerised trees is that an air pot, ultimately you lift the tree during the dormant season, you air pot it. You don't want to be touching that tree and bringing it to site until September, October, because otherwise you're going to be damaging all of those new roots that are starting to grow out into the rooting medium surrounding the root ball. Containerised trees, whether it's potted or bagged, I think the really important thing to note, and this is for any tree, we spend far too much time looking at the canopy and less time looking at the root balls. But what we don't want to see is trees ending up in a root ball grave. And ultimately, these trees, a number of different reasons why they're there. It could be that they've got damage to the canopy, but ultimately girdling roots. So what I'd encourage anyone to do when they're using containerized or bagged trees is to really look at and inspect the roots, because once they're girdling, you can not undo that process, and therefore the longevity of the tree in the landscape is going to be limited. This is just to encourage people to look at below ground. We do, as I've said, spend far too much time looking at straight leaders, balanced crowns, and less time looking in the ground and at the most important structures of a tree, which are the roots. And there's a great indicator, really, if you're out there in a nursery, certainly looking at field-grown trees, is to look at the pits created by trees that have been recently lifted. And what you're looking for is no evidence of large roots around the boundary or perimeters of that pit. That shows that the tree has been managed well, it's been undercut regularly, and it's got a better chance of thriving once planting on site, and certainly less chance of going into transplant shock. And when you then start to look at root systems and the opportunity to air spade a root ball, you can start to see the mechanisms and process of transplanting trees and creating that fibrous root system that exists around the larger root structure. When it comes to design, I think this is the bugbear of many contractors when planting trees, particularly in pavements. Really need to consider the tree species. So when you look at the image on the left, that's a Corylus colorna. When you look at the root plate and the root flare and see all of that root system above ground, or certainly close to the surface, when it's been then planted in an urban situation underneath a tree grill, what invariably happens, because of those constraints caused by the tree's own characteristics, is you end up with a bit of self-binding gravel and a bit of drainage board wrapping around the trunk, which is less than ideal and certainly not best practice. But we are finding that coming up with solutions that respond to the tree species once it gets to site could be resolved well before, both in the design stages and ultimately the tree selection. When you move across to irrigating a tree once it's there on site, there's a convention that it's anywhere between 3 and 5 years after planting. It's important that you have triggers for watering. Certainly in our business, we're looking at the number of dry days, temperature, consistently at 25 degrees maybe is a good indicator, and then wind, particularly if trees are being used for wind mitigation, which is a common occurrence, particularly in London, where they're providing that mitigation for winds coming down off of big towers. Windy sites are only going to increase transpiration rates, which means the tree is inevitably losing more water. And is it 20 litres every other day or 70 litres per week? I think we need to be a lot more responsive to the actual conditions and the needs of the tree. I mean, we're in our operations looking at a volume of about 40 litres per 2.5 centimetres of diameter. So that's 160 to 175 litres per watering event for a 30-35 centimetre girth tree, which is far exceeds those numbers that are being quoted for trees in kind of recent years. And whether it's in a bag or via a pipe, the important thing not to forget is the area outside the root ball, because those soils surrounding need to be kept moist, because ultimately the roots are, you're wanting those roots to be coming out of the root ball into the surrounding soils. And if you really want to be specific, there is a calculation for water need, and that's looking at ultimately the evaporation rates versus the canopy cover, ultimately the area in which the tree is going to lose its water. So there is a method of calculating exactly how much water a particular tree may need on site. And this is just a bit of encouragement. We have plenty of tree calls across the business, and we are looking below the ground. And you have to trust your instincts. You have to touch it and feel it. You need to get soil out of the root ball to assess whether it's too wet, ideal, or too dry, and respond your watering regime to suit the conditions. And this is I've been known for talking about this aspect when it comes to schemes making the front pages of newspapers where trees have failed or large areas of whips and transplants have failed. But we're often in this commercial world whereby the break-even position is discussed. And, I've been in meetings where it has been, and I'm often scratching my head thinking we're in a world where we're supposed to be planting trees for long-term establishment. Yet ultimately we have sometimes client teams looking at the risk of trees failing versus the cost of having to replace them and trying to offset ultimately the cost of maintaining that tree. And if you took two commonly specified sizes, there is true justification for the investment in maintenance, because the larger the tree, your break-even position is sitting in the order of about 13 to 16%. With your 14 to 16, that increases. So investing in management and maintenance is an absolute no-brainer. And carbon sequestration. I'm often challenging the concept that planting a tree is going to contribute to sequestering the carbon that was generated from building the scheme. But if a tree is planted and it fails to establish, its leaf area index is ultimately the process that drives light capture. If there's less leaf cover, that's lower. If there's smaller leaves because it's struggling to establish, that reduces the total area of leaf cover, ultimately resulting in slower photosynthesis, which, if you add transplant shock in, that's going to reduce the ability to take water up. The stomata will close, canopy efficiency drops, tree loses its leaves, sap flow stops, and ultimately you end up with a bigger drop in net sequestration during that period. And particularly in the first year, that tree is not going to be functioning at 100%, and it's more likely to be sat in the order of 50% of efficiency. And what I'm going to do is challenge the conventions of old. We talk about root to shoot balance, but ultimately in this world where trees need the ability to generate food, we need to keep the leaves that we've got. Removing foliage is only going to be of detriment to the engine that builds roots and sequesters carbon. And in a changing climate, what does that mean for tree species selection? I'd much rather see less betula being specified, particularly in urban environments. I'd never seen the image on the left before, but having planted a number of birch on a scheme 5 years ago during that significant drought, pretty much all of them were displaying signs of the sap boiling just below the cambium, blistering and ultimately going on to fail. Whenever I see a birch tree, I see ultimately a tree ICU unit. We are having to water these trees more than any other species. Their establishment is significantly impacted as a result of temperature and being placed in situations that aren't, typical riparian landscapes where these trees thrive. And there's going to be a greater need for sun protection. I never thought I'd be saying that in my career. It was very common, certainly very common on the continent, but plains are known for shedding their bark, but this is sloughing on a different scale this summer, where trees are certainly feeling the effects of those dry winds and high temperatures. So wrapping bark is going to be incredibly important and should be being specified from the get-go in specs, so that we can protect particularly thin bark species during their early years of establishment. And different cycles. The image on the right, that's a tree responding to stress. And the times I've had to explain why a tree sheds its leaves and the importance of checking for sap flow, which is the greatest indicator of the tree being still functioning and it's still got its vascular system working. What you need to be doing is checking that sap flow is moving up to the outer reaches of the tree, which in this case it is. But we're having to adapt watering regimes, and drenching is becoming a much more common approach. And we're just fortunate that in this case we had self-binding gravel anchored down the water behind it. But these trees were receiving best part of 1,000 litres of water in a single delivery 3 times a week, to just ensure that they had sufficient water to replenish that the water that's been lost through the canopy, but equally keeping the root ball hydrated and the surrounding soils hydrated to encourage the roots outside of the root ball. And I guess we've talked lots about size of trees on planting. And this is a black poplar planted as part of the Jubilee celebrations in 2012 on the left. And that's it 10 years later. So whilst you wouldn't necessarily be planting 4 to 6 centimetre girth trees on all of your schemes, there is certainly a justification for planting smaller trees that will go on to ultimately outperform trees that are planted at a larger specification on day one. And of course, soils, we need to remember that there are ultimately systems in place, the water cycle, the reliance trees have on soil, and its ability, certainly in manufactured soils, to dry out very quickly. In 3 days, a soil can go from optimum to suboptimum in its condition. Therefore, its water holding capacity is less, which will impact the establishment. What would I wish for? Certainly more diversity in tree species selection. Let's get away from birch. Let's start to see much more diversity in tree species that are on plan. And in order to do that, you kind of need to start now. If you look back at the timescales it takes to produce these trees, we should have had our orders placed. And for as long as nurseries, or for as long as trees are being specified on projects and they're being purchased, nurseries will continue to produce them. So that, I suppose, that leap of faith, that change in specification needs to start now to ultimately set the trend for the future. And to finish off, just remember every line on that drawing means something. And this is an image that I took when I stumbled across this person air spading out a trench below a very established tree in order to put a land drain in to function for suds. Thank you very much for your time, and I think we're now going to have some questions.
Very many thanks, Alistair. I'm sure everyone will agree that your presentation was very informative and extremely inspiring. I'm now going to hand over to Carl, who will talk through the root ball anchoring in a changing climate. So over to you, Carl.
Thanks for joining us. That was a fantastic presentation by Alistair. I'll do my best to keep things as brief and engaging as possible. Right. By now you should have a good understanding of what root ball anchoring is, so I won't revisit the basics. Instead, I want to explore the important question of why use it. There are several key benefits that we've spoken about before, but I'll just brush over them quickly. Aesthetics, obviously landscape architects and garden designers love the natural look it creates. Trees appear as though they've always been there, stable, secure, and free from unsightly supports. There's the question of reduced aftercare or maintenance, as Alistair brought up. With root ball anchoring, maintenance needs drop significantly. Considering how often post-planting care is neglected, that's a huge advantage. And obviously it's better than the alternative, which is staking, which I find is counterintuitive. It increases the maintenance time, consumes more resources, in my opinion, inflicts more carbon, and frankly, just looks unattractive. But let's move on to what I'm really here for, which is supporting tree establishment, a topic that Alistair spoke about rather extensively. Root ball anchoring plays a crucial role in helping trees establish. While it stabilizes the tree completely, it doesn't interfere with the trunk. This allows natural movement, strengthening the cambium, encouraging tapering, and improving overall health. In response, the tree invests more energy below ground, leading to stronger lateral roots that spread out for greater stability, a thicker taproot for species that have one, or deeper sinker roots. And most importantly, it increases biomass overall, which is critical when it comes to carbon sequestration. So why does this matter, especially in the context of climate change? Well, apart from carbon sequestration, which Alistair touched on and which he really highlighted the need for tree establishment, I've also chosen 3 real climate change scenarios where strong established trees can have a significantly positive influence on their environment. Where you have changing wood patterns due to climate change, this is obviously becoming a massive issue in places like Europe and the Middle East, where we've seen increased wind conditions. Trees act as natural windbreaks, help reduce soil erosion and improve biodiversity by creating little microclimates. When droughts hit, which is another critical issue for climate change, trees can maintain soil structure and water retention, helping to reduce the strain on the local ecosystems during this drought. Rise in sea levels, which is always on everyone's top of their list when it comes to climate change, and temperature brings with it increased salinity. And trees can help retain fresh water, improve the soil structure, and even potentially lower the water table, thereby prohibiting saline from rising to the surface. Right, let me just end off by saying that every planting situation, especially the challenging ones, need to have the method of root ball anchoring solution considered very carefully. For example, soil conditions can change the type of stabilization point used. Is the ground soft? Has drought changed its composition? If the area has salinity issues, do we use stainless steel to prevent rapid corrosion, or will galvanized steel be sufficient? In high wind conditions, should we be adding additional stabilization points to give us more load and ensure stability? And then, of course, in extreme conditions, and just to keep the tree up and living, we may need to use overhead guying. In terms of measuring the carbon the carbon handprint of our kits, we have done that. So please ask us for that information wherever you need it. In order to keep it to a minimum, we source our products from within the UK and do so as ethically as possible. Either way, a conversation with us can help you best plan for any climate change eventuality you face, and thereby give your tree its very best chance of getting established and helping us fight climate change together. Now, this has been an incredibly summarized presentation on a very diverse and interesting topic, but I hope it gets you reading further on how our beautiful trees and the root ball anchoring thereof can help us daily with climate change related issues. Thank you again to Alistair, and thank you again for hanging in there. Over to the Q&A now, Mandy.
Thank you, Carl. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these questions that you have for Alistair. Are you ready for this, Alistair?
Yeah. All right.
Okay. All right. So first one we have is from Tim Hell, who asks, Alistair, you've worked on both large projects and small projects, i.e. the Chelsea Flower Show. What are the differences between them, or are they both equally challenging?
As equally challenging as they can be, really. I think if I was to straw poll a lot of the project managers and contract managers that I've worked with, they'd choose a large project over a small project, because you still need to invest the same amount of time tackling a number of the same factors that enable the delivery of a project. You also got a bit more time. Small projects are often delivered in very constrained periods of time, so there's less chance or less opportunity to perhaps smooth out some of the things that are factors that affect the delivery of a project, whether it's supply chain factors, whether it's just simply weather conditions. It all magnifies and becomes certainly more pressing on a smaller project. So perhaps I've answered that question by saying bigger projects for the ability to smooth out some of the risks.
Definitely. So another one from Tim is, at this year's Chelsea Flower Show, Tom Massey demonstrated a use of artificial intelligence for monitoring trees using sensors and determining when they need watering, etc. Have Frosts ever considered these ideas, or is it something that they already implement?
So we have moisture sensors on our irrigation systems that are recording soil moisture, and we can then remotely program or alter the program for water application via those systems. I mean, I'm a great believer that AI and tech are going to improve and certainly bring efficiencies to project delivery, but ultimately it's not immune to failure. Ultimately irrigation systems need pumps, they need power. Moisture sensors can be misleading, particularly if they're sat in a wet spot. So getting out there and looking, touching, actually assessing moisture, and using experience is a good way of ensuring that you're managing all of the risks associated with soil moisture levels, and checking that the automated bit is functioning properly. And there's ultimately nothing worse than trees that are too wet. So if you're in that automated cycle and the soils are wet and they continue to be irrigated, you're not going to be able to take that water away. So our teams are constantly present and monitoring visually and physically to ensure that trees and plants are getting the right resources they need to establish.
Yeah, like you say, hands-on, definitely. Okay, another question. What's the biggest mistake contractors make when planting large root ball trees?
Oh, funny how
Or
that's
if you know of
referenced
any.
contractors. I mean, why is
Sorry, that's
the
pointing the
large
finger.
root ball tree there in the first place? I think for me, handling is second to none. Ultimately, the most important operation during that process of planting a tree. But it's ultimately made even more complex when the tree species is thin barked, early sap riser. So when you're looking at planting trees in March and April, if it's a lime, platanus, it's got a high potential for bruising, high potential for, if the straps slip, of bark damage. So, handling is the most important aspect when it comes to planting large trees.
Yeah, I agree. Okay. So this is a bit of, there's a two sort of like parts of this question from somebody called Satu T. Shouldn't we also pay attention to sapling size in a matter that a younger tree would probably be more likely to adapt into new environment than an older one? Nowadays, everywhere architects want to plant bigger trees so that the site seems ready fast. But isn't this very ecological in the long run? Isn't it? Has anyone been doing any research on how younger saplings succeed versus older ones?
I think, yes, there's plenty of research out there. I mean, if you're in forestry, you're ultimately cultivating a crop. So you're usually cultivating that from smaller saplings. But, throughout the presentation, I've focused on a few things, whether that's the input and resources required to establish a tree, or its functionality for carbon sequestration, the embodied carbon in the tree being planted itself. And I used the phrase not so long ago where we talk about trees becoming carbon positive. And I don't think you can really achieve that without walking to a tree, picking the seed off of it and planting it directly below. And you see in nature that trees from seed have got a greater chance of establishing. But let's not forget, we often remove trees from landscapes, and there's no more resilient tree than one that's established and performing already. It's got a greater ability to adapt to the seasons and the challenges that are facing trees today. We plant big trees. They are specified regularly. There is that need for impact. There is that need for screening. I mentioned wind mitigation. Ultimately, trees are being used as assets in a street scene to protect humans from wind. And that increases the challenges of establishment, because a tree that's providing wind mitigation, guess what? It's clearly going to be very windy from the downdrafts from the towers that are being constructed. So
yes,
we need to consider that in terms of increased transpiration rates and increased need for water. I'm a great believer that planting smaller trees is better, but there are many decisions that influence tree specification, particularly on urban projects. When it comes to rural projects, I think, yes, you can plant smaller trees, but they still need management and maintenance. And that kind of correlation between a break-even position obviously intensifies the smaller the tree stock is. So you often find that management and maintenance isn't instructed because it costs more to water it than it costs to replace it. And that's the biggest conundrum in this industry at the moment. We can often, I think, wrongly look at whether a contractor is maintaining it properly. They may not be contracted to maintain it at all. And that's some of the decisions that are made in the commercial world. It's driven by risk. It's not driven by ideals. I would love to be maintaining trees and plants and see the industry maintaining trees and plants, whatever the size, in a way that ensures their long-term establishment.
Absolutely. So we have a question from Anna Helps, who says, what is tree girdling?
So it's specifically more common in containerized trees. So in effect, if the tree hasn't been looked after properly and repotted at the right time, as the roots come into contact with the pot or the bag, they start to then girdle. So they're wrapping around themselves. And once a root has started to do that, it's impossible to prevent it from doing it. So it will continue to girdle to the point where it limits the ability for the tree to maintain itself, both structurally, but equally will start to constrict its important assets in terms of its vascular system, and ultimately that tree will fail. So the best way of checking that, certainly if you're doing an inspection on the nursery, if it's a bag tree, just give the edge of the roots a feel. What you're wanting is to not be feeling roots that are running horizontally at the very least, and you also want to be not necessarily feeling the roots at the edge of the bag, because if it's being potted up and maintained regularly, you'll be seeing trees at their optimum in terms of their root ball structure.
I actually saw for the first time ever, when we were on the tour earlier this year, sunburn on a tree.
Yep.
Do trees ever recover from sunburn?
It depends on the significance of it. I mean, I showed an example of a plane tree, which is a species that's known for shedding its bark. So its ability to recover is certainly better than other species. It depends whether the cambion's been broken or split. So you often seen with sunburn that the tree will actually split vertically, and if it breaks the cambium, then you've got a tree that is going to really struggle to establish long term. What we want to be seeing, and certainly it comes down to contractors doing the right thing, but importantly specifiers managing expectations of clients, because of course these things are additions to the landscape. You know, we have had situations where, despite recommending protection for bark and protection to avoid sunburn, it's been considered to be unsightly and has been instructed for removal. So there has to be a balanced approach for the best outcome, and that for me is seeing much more use of protection, certainly to thin bark tree species that are more susceptible to it, and that's in place for, you know, at the very least a couple of seasons until the canopy is established enough to provide its own shading to the bark itself.
Thank you. Okay, so another question for you, Alistair. What methods does Frost use to ensure clients have a robust maintenance plan and a future-proof tree establishment strategy?
There's many ways I could answer this one. I think ultimately it comes down to, you know, what we want to see is a contract that's let with management and maintenance, and for a contractor to ultimately have the autonomy to make the right decisions at the right time. Prescriptive specifications don't work, not in this changing climate. We need horticulturalists, or we need to trust those people that are charged with maintaining and establishing landscapes to be influenced by that big yellow dot in the sky. You know, ultimately, we have to make decisions that respond to the challenges we face. If you look at meadows, quite simply, you know, some of them are performing well into October, November. Yet if you go to an old specification that prescribes that the meadow should be cut before the end of August, you're losing all of that forage material for biodiversity. And it's no different to trees ultimately. We want to be trusted to do our job. And importantly, during that period of time, it's about knowledge share and knowledge transfer. And we're dealing with a living thing. We're dealing with fundamentally two cycles in terms of the water cycle, carbon cycle. And we want to be seeing management recommendations from the contractor moving into the client era. So when schemes are handed back, the client continues with that strategy. But budgets are challenged. You look at, certainly in the local authority space, there are ever decreasing pots of money to look after landscapes. There's plenty of capital to build them. There's perhaps less revenue to maintain them. But we just make sure that we recommend and share our knowledge before we hand a project back, which we hope then informs that strategy. Where we'll end up with biodiversity net gain and that commercial obligation to establish thriving, functioning assets after 30 years is, yet to be seen, isn't it? We're at the early stages of that now.
Okay. So, Anna Preddy asks, how easy is it to adjust the dead man anchoring system once the tree is planted? If the tree is starting to lean within the first year after planting, how can this be corrected without digging the whole tree pit up? I know that obviously you won't be able to dig out the dead man system anyway once it's actually installed. Some people do actually leave the ratchet covered with bark or mulch or whatever, so that they can go back to retention. But if the tree has actually leaned too far, then our suggestion would be to, and they're able to do it, attach a guy fixing system, which they could potentially try to re-straighten the tree and leave that there for a couple of years. But in some urban places where trees are planted, that isn't always possible. But
correct. But Mandy, it all stems back to the spec. So ultimately, specify the right anchor, and ultimately ensure that your tree is suited to that anchor. So what we want to see when you look at canopy to root ball, you want a sufficient root ball that can anchor that tree. I mean, ultimately, it's a sail, and it's got no connectivity with the surrounding soil. So the anchor is providing that anchorage to keep it there whilst it establishes those roots. So we want a really healthy root ball that will get away quickly and into those surrounding soils. We want it of a size that can actually enable that anchor to perform its job. And we want the right anchor specified. And there's many ways, you look at whether it's a curb, but certainly in the past, we've looked at alternatives using steel mesh that sits below the root ball that actually provides a really significant fixing in areas that are windy, you haven't got the substrate depth, or you've got challenging conditions to ultimately install that tree. So it's, don't revert to perhaps a standard spec. Look at the site as a non-standard place. Talk to Platipus about the best system for that situation, and just ensure that the thing that you're fixing or anchoring is fit for anchoring.
And also soil, again, with any dead man system, whether it be using curbstones or our D-man system or the mesh, as you mentioned, is that compaction of the soil on top of the dead man, which is essential to keep any tree in place. Right, let's have a look. So on to the next one, which is from Jeremy Mark Parker. He has two questions, I believe. There seems to be a trend for contractors to remove watering and replacement obligations from their BOQs. What is your view, Alistair, on this trend?
I would say it's not a desire for a contractor to remove it. It goes back to that break-even position. So if we're, ultimately it comes down to the client or perhaps the principal contractor in that context. But when you're instructing a contractor, landscape contractor, to manage and establish trees during the defects period, you're buying a warranty. And I think sharing a common concern across the sector is that when management and maintenance is removed from contracts, we can no longer provide that warranty, and then it becomes you're playing it by chance ultimately if that scheme's not being managed and maintained. I'd love for this industry to be fully resourced in all areas to ensure that the best spec at planting, the best management and maintenance post planting. But we are in a very constrained environment financially, where if you're in last, which often this landscape is in last to any big commercial project, often they're looking at the line item and considering whether it's a worthy investment or not. And you can't get away from the fact either that I've started to go into projects I built at the start of my career to improve them, and that often entails removing trees that I planted 20 years ago. It's an industry that I would say at the moment is still considered to be disposable.
Sad. So the second question from Jeremy Mark Parker is: tree planting is being pushed by BNG. This results in the more demand for fewer native tree species rather than greater diversity of tree species suited to climate change. Again, asking what your view is, Alistair.
So I think the challenge that we face is that when you look at the decisions made, perhaps in the 80s, 90s, where tree nurseries of a scale stopped producing, stopped investing in the future because of competition. It's no different to looking at the conundrum that faces farming and food security, because it was very much it was delivered in scale in Europe, so we were naturally competing with Europe for I suppose an industry that was able to be self-sufficient and supply itself. BNG, it's ultimately it's like no other or any other assessment where you're looking at numbers, you're looking at achieving a greater score from the proposals. We, as I've said, we should have been planting or producing trees for a changing climate over 10 years ago. 20 years ago would have been ideal. And as long as trees continue to be specified, we cannot get away from the fact that nurseries are businesses. So if there is demand for a particular tree species, it will continue to be produced on scale. And those species that we need aren't being produced on scale. Therefore, availability is constrained. So where we want to see is specifiers starting to engage and talk to nurseries to ensure that nurseries are meeting the future demands of the sector. And that will be tree species that have diversity and range that can cope with the climate that we're going to be facing in the future.
Yeah. Hey, right. So Katie Terry asks, not all trees can be checked ahead of receiving them. If you were to receive a root girdle tree, can you do anything about this, such as prune these roots to help them grow out correctly?
I think if Keith Saker was on the call, he'd say you can't. I mean, we have been manipulating trees ever since we started wanting trees in our gardens and landscapes. They are grown by pruning out certain branches. We are making that assessment. We are not assessing the tree's hormonal balances and where it's sending its growth stimulus. It's the same with the roots. So it's my understanding, and certainly through experience, once a tree is girdling, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to stop it continuing in that cycle. What it comes down to is a good producer is going to be limiting that. Your role on receiving it to site is to look at the qualitative requirements and reject it. I have no hesitation rejecting a tree that's not in accordance with a specification or the quality expectations that producers should be supplying their stock to.
Absolutely. Okay. Peter Scholes, having seen numerous failed root ball trees, wire mesh, after 10 years in the ground, what are your thoughts on root ball trees in general, especially in relation to root mass?
Is that because of the root ball, or is that because of the wire?
The wire mesh. I think that obviously there has been, I think, some controversy over the years that people say, do you remove the mesh before you plant a tree? Well, we say absolutely not. It comes like that. That is obviously how. So I think that sort of is where the wire mesh that he's asking about. Yeah.
I mean,
Will it
my
affect?
experience, and I can reliably quote this because I've been planting trees beyond 10 years of age. I haven't seen root ball trees fail in the landscape as a result of being wire root balled. We leave the mesh on. The important thing is in today's world of planting 365 days of the year, if you're planting root balled stock out of season, just make sure that coir is removed because it's pretty much an impenetrable barrier to roots going out and roots accessing the water that they need ultimately.
Right. And there's another one from Katie Terry. Is it possible to access a copy of the BS 8545 free of charge? What sections of these standards do you recommend paying particular attention to?
So no, unfortunately not free of charge. So you have to pay for access. And then with regards to the sections, what the standard is, and it's, I suppose, a move away from the old conventional standards, is its knowledge, industry knowledge from experts in the field, and its recommendations that aren't necessarily as prescriptive as other BS standards, which is about performance. This is about sharing best practice and guidance in how you take nursery stock to establishment, and it gets you to challenge the conventions. So when we consider what the National Plant Specification says, this is, as new as we can expect at the moment of a standard that reflects what we're doing today. And those standards take a significant amount of time to update and get through that process. So what our reliance is on a contractor, of course, is when something's specified contractually, that's the environment in which we're operating. So unless someone can adapt and provide best guidance, if it comes to it, at the raw end of contractual debate or certainly challenge, if the advice is wrong, you're being judged on incorrect advice. And I would say today, we can't be as prescriptive as we used to be. We're adapting to something that's changed significantly in the last 5 years. Throughout my career, you could be pretty much reliable on what you were doing up until 10 years ago. But the acceleration in the last 5 years means that the rule book, throw it out. You've got to be responsive to what you're facing today, and then we'll see what tomorrow brings, because there is no consistent in horticulture and commercial landscaping at this stage.
No. Well answered. Thank you. If it's with regard to frosts, they do grow some of their own trees. Am I right in saying? Is that correct?
No.
You don't.
Would have been in the old kind of nursery days for sure, but no, we're relying on supply chain.
And where do you source? Do you source from the UK or do you
UK,
abroad or
European? So anywhere from, well, Lower Saxony, ultimately, that lovely growing region that extends kind of North Netherlands through to northeast Germany. We've obviously got supply chain here in the UK. I think what we need to just burst in that bubble. We often look at UK grown stock, but what is UK grown stock? By definition, it's something that's been here for 12 months. It might even be less now.
Yes.
And we've got to, you've got to understand your procurement routes. Majority of stock at the moment originates from Europe. Starter stock is grown en masse in Europe.
Yeah.
We need to invest in UK grown, but we need to invest in all aspects of UK grown, because to produce your 30-35, you need that cycle of the starter stock being grown in the UK and it successionally being transplanted up until the point that it achieves the specification that can then be sold. And because of the things I've mentioned before, we just haven't got huge volumes of the same species. And when you look at perhaps the generational extents of nurseries on the continent, you're talking about 5th generation families that have grown trees for 200 years. They've got the stock, they've got that cycle in place. It's tried and tested. We're almost in some ways starting again. There's some great examples out there of nursery businesses investing in the future, and we'll get there at some point. But ultimately, it's not necessarily today.
No. I think, judging by this, you've answered all of the questions, Alistair. So I think that just to say a very big thanks to Alistair. It was a wonderful presentation, very knowledgeable, and I'd like to thank everybody for watching. In the meantime, please follow us on our social media feeds, Twitter, Facebook and LinkedIn. We love to share content and look forward to hearing from you. So all that's left for me to say is that this concludes our webinar for today.